Have you ever wondered how far someone would go to protect the image of a perfect family, at the cost of something truly irreplaceable? When my daughter Lila was clinging to life in a hospital bed, my parents were boarding a private jet to Paris. Not for an emergency, not for something noble, but for my brother's wedding, complete with designer gowns, drone cameras, and a press team ready to capture every glittering moment. They raised their glasses in a toast while I stood alone, trembling, begging a doctor to give me just a little more time to find the money for Lila's surgery. This isn't a story about a medical crisis. It's about what happens when appearances matter more than people, and blood ties become just another PR tool. It's about what you do when the people you hoped would show up don't. And how sometimes the ones who do aren't even related to you. I wasn't born into just any family. I was born into a legacy. The Quinns were a name, a brand, a curated lifestyle admired across Los Angeles and beyond. My father, Richard Quinn, was a real estate developer whose face often appeared in business magazines, shaking hands with celebrities at fundraisers or delivering keynote speeches about urban transformation. My mother, Eleanor, was once a costume designer for film studios, but she eventually shifted into luxury lifestyle branding, redecorating spaces for high-profile clients and subtly inserting herself into their social circles. Together, they weren't just admired, they were emulated. To the outside world, we were the epitome of a power family. Intelligent, elegant, warm, and successful. But what the world saw was only the lighting, not the cracks beneath the surface. From the moment I could speak, I was trained to fit into their aesthetic. Not just how to smile for the camera, but when to speak, how to phrase things, and, more often, when to stay silent. My childhood felt like a long series of rehearsals. Appearances mattered more than emotions, and no mistake was small enough to be forgiven if it threatened our image. Perfection wasn't a goal in our house, it was a requirement. Then there was Julian. My younger brother Julian was everything I wasn't, at least in my parents' eyes. He had their charisma, their flair for performance, and a natural confidence that glided him through rooms I could barely step into. From an early age, he was photographed in brand-sponsored clothing, mentioned in interviews, even invited onto panels about young influencers. He had a million-watt smile and the kind of personality that played perfectly. On social media, he was charming in a way that made people forget to look deeper. I, on the other hand, was quiet. Analytical. I liked to draw and build things with my hands. I read books about light, form, space, how to change the way people felt through the physical environment. But my achievements were often met with silence or, worse, polite dismissal. When I won a district-wide academic award in middle school, my mother nodded slightly and said, "Well, you've always been a hard worker." But when Julian posted a shirtless photo after his first modeling shoot, she reposted it to her 50,000 followers with the caption, "My golden boy." That contrast followed us into every corner of our lives. Julian's mistakes were excused, softened, even glamorized. Mine were judged, picked apart, remembered. When he crashed my father's car at 19, they quietly settled it and posted a family brunch photo the next day. When I dyed my hair a shade too dark one summer, my mother told me I looked off-brand. College became my escape plan. I applied to Parsons School of Design in New York without telling them. When I got in, I told them over dinner. My father barely looked up from his tablet. "It's your life," he said. "Just make sure you're not running away from something." That was the closest I got to a blessing. I left Los Angeles that fall with 2 suitcases, a scholarship, and a growing sense that I'd been raised more like an asset than a daughter. I didn't feel loved. I felt branded, managed, styled. Even away from them, their voice lingered in my head. When I started sharing my own projects on social media, small home redesigns, cafe interiors, I could almost hear my mother's critique. "It needs more gloss. Your captions are too personal. No one wants to see behind the curtain. But I kept posting. I kept designing. And I kept building something that was mine. Still, a piece of me wanted their approval, not because I needed validation, but because it was something I'd never had. I thought maybe, one day, I'd do something so undeniably good they'd finally see me. But I didn't understand then. Some people only recognize success when it elevates them. In my family, love was conditional, and I had already failed the one condition that mattered most. I wasn't Julian. New York wasn't easy, but it was honest. For the first time in my life, I wasn't being watched, styled, or corrected. I was just Natalie Quinn, student, freelance designer, nobody special. And in that anonymity, I began to feel something I never had before. Peace. It was in the tiny studio apartment with paint-chipped windows where I burned my first pot of rice but sketched into the night. It was in the crowded subway rides, headphones in, planning layouts in my head while tuning out the noise of everything I had left behind. I took on every project I could find. Tiny cafes in Queens, sublets in Brooklyn, yoga studios in Chinatown. My tools were borrowed, my budgets laughable, but I started seeing how space could heal people, how a room could change the way someone felt. Slowly, clients returned. Recommendations trickled in. I had no PR team, no glossy campaign. Just results. That was when I met Ethan. He wasn't dazzling in the way my brother was, or curated like the men my mother used to gently suggest I should consider dating. Ethan was calm, patient. A public school history teacher with ink-stained fingers and a voice that could calm a storm. We met at a friend's cramped housewarming, where he asked me about color psychology instead of my follower count. I remember telling him about a project I'd done for a trauma recovery center, how I'd used warm light and curved furniture to ease tension in patients, and he just listened. Not to impress me, not to respond, but because he cared. I wasn't used to that. I wasn't used to being heard without performing. We married 2 years later in a small garden in upstate New York. There were no drone cameras, no brand sponsors, just friends, laughter, and a lot of handmade decorations we designed ourselves. I sent my parents an invitation, half hoping they'd come, half terrified they actually might. They didn't respond, not even a message. Julian posted a photo from a Malibu yacht that same day with the caption, "Family time is everything." I didn't cry. I just folded the invitation and placed it in a box I kept for things I no longer chased. A year later, Lila was born. She arrived on a rainy Thursday morning, with a full head of dark hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. From the moment I held her, I knew that the world would never look the same again. Suddenly, every decision I made was filtered through her safety, her joy, her future. She was thoughtful like her father, but expressive like me. She loved flipping through picture books before she could read, rearranging her toy shelves, building little rooms out of blankets and pillows. Sometimes I'd find her sketching, with crayons on napkins saying she was helping mommy design. Lila didn't just fill our home, she gave it its soul. We didn't have much, just a rent-controlled apartment near Prospect Park and a second-hand car Ethan used for school trips. But we were happy. We took walks every weekend, cooked together, danced in the kitchen. I still ran my interior design business, slowly growing it into a boutique studio called Haven. Most of my clients were small business owners, new families, people trying to build something with limited resources, just like I had. And I made it my mission to treat every project with the care I once wished someone had shown me. The only thing we didn't have was full medical insurance. I know how that sounds. Irresponsible, short-sighted. But our income was just enough to get by, and the premiums for comprehensive private insurance were brutal in New York. Every month I told myself, just a little longer, just until I land that next big project. We were healthy. Lila was strong, and I thought we had time. But life doesn't follow your timelines. It interrupts. It strikes when you're building momentum, when you're finally breathing easier. And in one moment, a cough, a fever, a call from the pediatrician, it can unravel everything you've worked for. I didn't know it yet, but the peace we had, built brick by brick, was about to be tested in the most brutal way imaginable. And I would learn, all over again, what family really meant. Not by blood, but by who shows up when it counts. It started with a cough, dry, shallow, barely enough to raise concern. Lila had always been healthy, the kind of child who bounced back from colds in a day or two, so when she first coughed during her bedtime story, I tucked her in a little tighter and promised to make her favorite soup the next day. But that night, I barely slept. The coughing grew louder, more persistent. By morning, her energy was low, and there was a strange flush to her cheeks that didn't come from running around. Ethan called in sick to work while I scheduled an appointment with her pediatrician. The doctor didn't panic. She listened, examined, asked questions, and said it was likely bronchitis. We were told to monitor her and return if symptoms worsened, but they did. Quickly. Within days, Lila grew pale and weak. She no longer wanted to draw. Her laugh disappeared. One night, while folding laundry, I heard a soft voice from the hallway. "Mommy, my heart feels funny." She clutched her chest, tears forming. That was the moment everything shifted. We rushed her to the emergency room at Mount Sinai. The waiting room felt endless, its sterile air cold and unforgiving. Lila lay across two plastic chairs with Ethan's jacket covering her like a blanket. I held her hand while my mind spiraled. Should I have brought her in sooner? Had I missed a sign? Was this my fault? When the nurse called her name, we scrambled to our feet. The next few hours blurred into fluorescent lights, machines beeping, and clipped medical jargon. They ran blood tests, scans, x-rays. No one said the word aloud, but every doctor's expression told us we were not overreacting. When the attending physician finally returned, his face was still. He carried a folder and spoke gently but directly. They had discovered a mass, an abnormal growth, pressing against her left lung. Likely benign, he said, but its position was dangerous. It was causing pressure on her airway, leading to her fatigue, her shallow breathing, and the tightness in her chest. It needed to be removed, and soon. We recommend surgery within the next 5 days, he told us, sooner if possible. My breath caught before I could ask the next question, but he beat me to it. The procedure, including post-operative care and hospitalization, is estimated at around $98,000. It didn't feel real. It felt like the ground tilted beneath me. We didn't have that kind of money. We had savings, yes, but nothing close to that figure. My hands instinctively reached for my phone, opening our banking app like a reflex. Ethan squeezed my shoulder. I could feel him trying to stay strong for both of us, but I saw the tremble in his jaw. The hospital offered payment plans, but only for a portion. The rest needed to be secured up front. Without private insurance, there were no shortcuts, only barriers. I called our bank. Our credit score wasn't high enough for an emergency loan of that size. I posted on my social media platforms, hoping former clients or friends might share our story. But time was moving faster than donations could catch up. Every hour we delayed, the risk to Lila increased. I spent the first night in a chair beside her hospital bed. She slept under a tangle of IV lines and machines that hummed with quiet authority. Every now and then, her small hand would twitch, in her sleep, reaching for something I couldn't give her: comfort, safety, a promise. I whispered over and over that she would be okay, but I wasn't sure who I was trying to convince: her or myself. At 3 a.m., I walked into the hallway and stood under the harsh fluorescent lights, staring at the tile floor like it might offer a solution. I had always been proud of my independence, proud that I had built a life without leaning on my family's name or wealth. But that pride was costing me time. Time Lila didn't have. I opened my contacts, scrolled down to Mom, and hesitated. My thumb hovered over the call button. They had turned their backs on me so many times, I had vowed never to ask them for anything again. But this wasn't about me. This was about my daughter, their granddaughter. And as much as I hated the thought of it, I whispered aloud, maybe they'll care this time. I pressed call. It rang twice before someone picked up. Eleanor's voice came through, poised, cold, familiar. Natalie, why are you calling at this hour? I took a breath so deep it hurt. Mom, I said, Lila is in the hospital. She needs surgery. We can't afford it, please. I need your help. There was silence on the other end. Then, finally, her response. Natalie, this really isn't a good time. I stood there holding the phone, stunned into silence. I had expected hesitation, maybe even judgment, but not that. An outright dismissal. Not from a grandmother hearing that her granddaughter was in critical condition. This really isn't a good time, she had said, as if I were asking her to reschedule a manicure rather than help save a child's life. I tried to keep my voice steady. I'm not asking you to cancel anything. I'm just asking for help. A part of it. Anything. Please, Mom. Lila needs surgery. She could die. The silence that followed felt heavier than any words. Then Eleanor sighed. You have to understand, Natalie. We've been planning Julian's wedding for over a year. It's not just a family event. There are endorsements, partnerships, media contracts. You know how these things work. This would be incredibly disruptive. That was it. Disruptive. I didn't say goodbye. I couldn't. I simply hung up the phone, my hands numb, my body frozen in that hospital corridor. I stared out the window, at the dark skyline, and wondered how people who taught me to always present perfection could be so indifferent when real imperfection, the kind that breaks you, finally showed up. For a few hours, I debated what to do. I tried not to cry in front of Lila. I held her hand, read her stories, and kissed her forehead, pretending I was calm, collected, prepared. But I wasn't. I was desperate. And when you're desperate, pride becomes a luxury. So I made a decision. I never imagined I would make again. I booked a flight to Paris. Julian's wedding was being held at a restored 18th century chateau in the French countryside, just outside Paris. The guest list read like a Forbes 30 under 30 reunion. Influencers, startup founders, heirs, and heiresses. It was scheduled to span 4 days, complete with a press lounge, drone footage, and branded hashtags. I couldn't afford the hotel they had blocked out for guests, so I found a cheap room in a nearby town and paid for a standby ticket using the last of my savings. I didn't sleep on the plane. I kept replaying what I would say, how I would approach them. Maybe face to face they would see how serious this was. Maybe seeing me broken would finally break their performance. Or maybe, deep down, I was just hoping someone would finally put love above optics. I arrived at the chateau on the afternoon of the welcome reception. Everyone was dressed in whites and creams, champagne in hand, moving through the manicured gardens like extras in a luxury perfume ad. Music floated through the air, delicate and expensive. For a moment, I stood at the edge of the crowd, completely out of place in my black coat and travel-wrinkled dress, holding a folder of Lila's medical documents against my chest like armor. Spotted Eleanor first. She was laughing with a group of stylists and brand reps, wearing a pearl-studded gown and sipping champagne as if her life had never known discomfort. I walked straight toward her. When she saw me, her smile faltered, eyes narrowing just slightly. "Natalie," she said, her voice tight. "What are you doing here?" "I need 5 minutes," I said, voice shaking. "Please, it's about Lila." She glanced around. "Not now. You shouldn't be here. It's important," I cut in. "She's in the hospital. She needs emergency surgery. She moved closer, lowering her voice. Do you know how this looks? What are you trying to do? Make a scene? I'm trying to save my daughter's life, I replied, barely containing the fury rising in my throat. She's your granddaughter. Before she could answer, Julian appeared behind her, arms slung around his fiancée, both of them glowing in coordinated beige. Wow, he said, cocking his head. Didn't expect to see you here. Press pass? Or just crashing? I turned to him, holding out the folder. Lila needs surgery. We don't have the money. I'm not asking for a miracle, just some help. I thought maybe you'd care. Julian took a sip of his drink, then smirked. So, because you didn't plan ahead, now we're responsible for fixing your mess? That's rich, Nat. You spend hundreds of thousands on this wedding, I said, my voice rising. And you can't spare anything to save her life? He laughed, soft and cruel. You always did love playing the martyr. People were watching now. Conversations. Paused. Eleanor grabbed my arm, her nails digging slightly. Natalie, lower your voice. You're embarrassing yourself. This isn't the place. I pulled away. No, you're right. It's not the place. Because this circus, is what matters to you. Not your family. Not your granddaughter. My father appeared then, drawn by the commotion. He looked older than I remembered, but no less stern. What's going on? He asked, scanning the crowd, the discomfort, the cameras. She came to beg, Julian said flatly. For money. Richard turned to me, expression unreadable. Natalie, we're in the middle of something very important. So am I whispered. I'm trying to keep my child alive. He sighed, shaking his head. You shouldn't have come here. Stood in the middle of the reception, surrounded by flowers flown in from Amsterdam, chandeliers hung in trees, and guests with camera phones raised discreetly. No one moved. No one offered comfort. No one asked if Lila would be okay. I thought, if I showed you, if I came here, you might remember what it means to be a parent, I said. But I see now you never were. And with that, I turned and walked away. I didn't look back. Every step down the gravel path felt heavier, but each one was necessary. Because the truth had finally bloomed in full. They weren't my family. Not where it counted. Not when it mattered. And if they could abandon a child in need to preserve their image, then they didn't deserve to be part of her future. Or mine. I didn't cry on the flight home. I didn't scream or shake. I sat in that cramped economy seat with Lila's folder, on my lap, and the memory of that perfect Parisian celebration burned into the back of my mind. There had been a moment, just one, when I thought someone might come after me. My mother, maybe even Julian. But they hadn't. No one did. And that silence, that collective indifference, was more painful than any argument could have been. Back in New York, the air felt heavier. Or maybe I just carried more weight now. When I stepped into Lila's hospital room, she opened her eyes, weakly, and smiled. You're back, she whispered. I kissed her forehead and smiled back, though my hands were shaking. I had come home without the money, without help, without hope. But I wasn't empty, because in the days that followed, something began to shift. Not through blood, but through bond. Ethan, without hesitation, sold his most cherished possession, his late father's vintage guitar, the one he had planned to give Lila one day. We'll buy her a new one, he said simply, when she's old enough to learn. I listed everything I owned that wasn't absolutely necessary. My work computer, my watch, my office furniture, even a vintage coffee table I had refinished myself. Every time I let something go, it hurt. But not as much as the thought of losing her. And then, something miraculous happened. People started reaching out. Not the glamorous names, Not the followers or the influencers, but the real people. Quiet people. Kind people. A client I had helped redesign her late husband's study sent me $2,000 with a note. You turned grief into a space I could breathe in. I hope this helps you breathe now. A barista from the cafe I worked in during college messaged me. I don't have much, but here's $100. I remember how you used to tip me when no one else did. I opened my inbox one morning to a message from Sophia, a fellow student from Parsons I hadn't spoken to in years. She had gone on to become a children's book illustrator. Attached was a receipt of a $3,500 transfer and the words, "Lila sounds like the kind of girl I'd write about. I hope she grows up to read those stories." It didn't stop there. A woman I had only met once at a networking event, who remembered me helping her carry her samples up 5 flights of stairs, sent $500. One of my interns, a young man who had just landed his first design job, handed me an envelope with $280. I was going to buy a new tablet, he said, eyes wet, but she needs it more. Even strangers joined in. People who had seen my quiet post online without drama or demands, simply asking for help to save a little girl with too much light to lose. They donated in small amounts, $5, $20, $75. And slowly, miraculously, the balance began to grow. Ethan's parents, Carol and Jim, visited the hospital one evening. They brought a thermos of homemade soup and a quiet, unwavering offer. They would take out a second mortgage on their modest home in Albany if we needed it. She's our granddaughter too, Jim said, placing a firm hand on Ethan's shoulder. I don't think I'd ever seen my husband cry until that moment. Within 5 days, we had raised nearly $60,000, still far from the total, but more than I ever imagined possible. It wasn't the amount that overwhelmed me. It was the intention. Each dollar came from someone who had nothing to gain, from people who owed me nothing, who didn't care about optics or last names, who weren't thinking about reputation or branding. These were not people who had raised me. But in every action, they proved they were my true family. Lila remained stable, though weak. The doctors gave us 1 more week to gather the rest before rescheduling the surgery. I remember sitting in the hospital corridor with Ethan, exhausted, but grateful, holding a printed list of everyone who had donated. Not because I wanted to tally favors, but because I needed to remember what real love looked like. What community could mean when everything else had failed. There was no press, coverage, no branded hashtag, no curated post. But there was warmth, there was kindness. And in those quiet acts, I felt something being rebuilt. Not just our finances, but our faith. Not just hope, but power. We were still short of the full amount. But now, for the first time, I believed we might get there. Because if strangers could show up when family walked away, then maybe, just maybe, the world wasn't as cold as I thought. Maybe it was just waiting for us to stop looking up and start looking around. 3 days before the surgery deadline, I was sitting in the hospital cafeteria, going through the numbers again for the 100th time, when Carol quietly slid a manila envelope across the table toward me. She didn't say anything at first, just looked at me with a calm, steady gaze that only years of quiet resilience could shape. I opened the envelope, and inside were documents, a property sale contract. She and Jim had sold their home. It was a good price, she said, almost too casually. We've moved into a small rental down the street from Ethan's old school. It's just a house, Natalie. We've lived in a lot of places, but Lila only has one life. I didn't speak. I couldn't. I pressed my face into her shoulder and wept. Not the dramatic sobs of grief, but the quiet, cracking tears that come when someone shows you love in its purest form. They had sold their future so my daughter could have hers. With the full amount secured, the hospital confirmed. The surgery. Lila was prepped. I held her tiny hand as they wheeled her into the operating room. The surgery took over 6 hours. Ethan paced. I sat clutching the beaded bracelet Lila had made for me in preschool, the one that read, "Best Mom Ever," in mismatched plastic letters. When the doctor finally walked in, he was smiling. "She's going to be okay," he said. "She's incredibly strong." That was the day everything changed. Not just because Lila survived, but because something inside me was reborn. My daughter had faced death, and my chosen family had faced ruin to save her. That kind of love didn't just deserve gratitude, it deserved growth. So I made a decision. I would rebuild, not just for us, but for every person who had stood beside me. The first step was relaunching my business. I rebranded it completely. Haven Studio became Haven Collective, a new name, a new mission, to design spaces that restore. I poured my energy into every project, drawing on everything I had learned about how rooms could hold people, how color could calm, how light could give hope. I worked harder than I ever had before, not out of desperation, but out of purpose. My story had spread in whispers, friends telling friends, clients sharing my name. And then one day, a small business magazine reached out, asking to feature me for their Mothers Who Lead section. I hesitated. I didn't want sympathy, but I realized this was a chance to show what had truly carried me through. Not legacy, not wealth, but community. The article was honest. I didn't name names or dwell on drama, but I told the truth. I spoke about kindness from strangers, about what it means to lose your family and find a better one in its place. It went viral in a way I couldn't have predicted. Soon, local news picked it up. Then a popular podcast about resilience asked to interview me. Within 2 months, I had new clients from across the country. A boutique hotel group in Oregon hired me for a full rebrand. A wellness retreat in Arizona booked my team for 6 months of design work. I hired more staff, young designers, single moms, students like I had once been. I made it a point to pay them fairly, to mentor them with empathy, to never forget what it felt like to be invisible. And, while I thrived, something else happened in the background, quietly, steadily. People began to connect the dots. The Quinn name was hard to hide. Julian's wedding footage resurfaced, juxtaposed with headlines about a woman who had been rejected by her powerful family while her daughter was dying. Anonymous accounts reposted clips. The narrative shifted. They chose a wedding over a child's life. Now she's more powerful than all of them. Richard's company started losing investors. Eleanor was dropped from 2 lifestyle partnerships. Julian's influencer. Contracts were paused. The public wasn't cruel, just observant. And when a story rings true, it's hard to look away. I didn't gloat. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Justice, when it arrives slowly, speaks louder than revenge ever could. Then came the moment I never expected. Forbes Interiors featured Haven Collective in their top 30 under 40 list of emerging design leaders. My photo appeared alongside industry giants, but I wasn't in a high-rise office. I was standing in Lila's room, her drawings on the wall behind me. I told the journalist the truth. I'm not here because I outworked everyone. I'm here because people loved my daughter enough to help when no one else did. I owe everything to them. That quote was printed on the cover, and that was the moment I realized I hadn't just survived the worst chapter of my life. I had rewritten the ending, not for revenge, not for applause, but for legacy, the kind that isn't passed down through bloodlines, but built, slowly, deliberately, with kindness, courage, and grace. The article had barely been out a week when the call came. I was in the middle of a site visit in Tribeca, walking a client through lighting options for a minimalist spa project, when my phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar, but something in me knew. I excused myself and stepped outside into the late afternoon air. When I answered, There was a long silence before a voice I hadn't heard in over a year finally spoke. "Natalie, it's your mother." Just hearing Eleanor's voice pulled something taut inside me, like a string I thought I'd cut long ago, suddenly tugging at my chest. She didn't wait for me to respond. We're in trouble." I stayed quiet, she continued, each word a little more forced than the last. "Your father, he took out a loan on the West Hollywood property to try and keep the company afloat. The media, the backlash, it was more than we expected. We're about to lose. The house. And Julian. Well, you probably know what happened with his contracts." Of course I knew. Julian's name had become a quiet cautionary tale in influencer circles. The golden boy who smirked on camera while his niece lay dying. He'd tried to spin it, of course. But the internet doesn't forget. "I know we've made mistakes," Eleanor went on. "But we're still your family. I'm not asking you to fix everything. We just need a loan. Something to hold us over. 200,000 would buy us some time." I closed my eyes. I thought of Lila's pale face in that hospital bed. I thought of Carol handing me the deed to her house. I thought of standing at that Paris wedding, being told to lower my voice, as if decency were disruptive. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I said, "Come to my office, tomorrow, noon, both of you." The next day, I prepared everything myself. I chose the third-floor conference room, the one with tall windows and natural light. I placed a sleek black suitcase at the center of the table. Inside, exactly $200,000 in crisp bills, stacked with clinical precision. No drama, just money. Exactly what they had once chosen over us. When they arrived, I almost didn't recognize them. Richard had aged 10 years in one. His suit hung looser, his hair was thinned and gray. Eleanor wore an old coat I remembered, from before the fame. She looked small, not physically, but in presence. Their shine was gone. They didn't sit until I gestured. They didn't speak until I let them. "This is the money you need," I said, my voice even. "It's yours." Eleanor reached for it with trembling fingers, but I stopped her with a single word. "Wait." She froze. "Before you take it." I continued. "You need to understand this. Once you walk out that door, I no longer consider you my parents." Richard's mouth opened, but no sound came. No contact. No calls. No visits. "This is the last time we speak. You won't be part of Lila's life. You won't see where we live or how we grow. You gave that up the day you chose image over her life." Eleanor burst into tears. "Natalie, please." I raised a hand, not in cruelty, but in finality. "I'm not doing this out of anger. I'm doing it to protect what I built. My peace, my child, my future." Richard's voice cracked for the first time. "We were wrong. We didn't know." "You knew," I said softly. "You just didn't care until it hurt your name." There was nothing left to say. I nodded to my assistant who escorted them out. They didn't fight. They didn't argue. They just walked out. Quiet, hunched, clutching the suitcase like it was their last anchor to the world they used to rule. When the door closed behind them, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel cruel. I felt clean, as if the final thread had been snipped. That night, Ethan held me in the quiet of our apartment. Lila was asleep, her sketchbook still open beside her. "You did the right thing," he whispered. I nodded. And I knew, for the first time in my life, that I had set the boundary my younger self had always been too scared to draw. Not out of revenge, but out of love. Love for the family I had built. Love for myself. In families built on appearances, emotional abandonment often hides behind carefully curated smiles. What Natalie faced wasn't just a crisis. It was a mirror held up to the difference between being loved and being useful. As a psychologist once said, Neglect doesn't always look like absence. Sometimes it wears pearls and gives polite nods while you silently fall apart. Natalie's story isn't just one of betrayal. It's about reclaiming worth, choosing boundaries, and defining family on her own terms. She didn't seek revenge. She didn't name names. She simply chose peace, and in doing so, found justice. So now I ask you, if someone who once turned their back on you came knocking, would you answer the door? Would you offer help or protect your healing? Let us know in the comments. What does family mean to you? Has someone ever surprised you with kindness when you needed it most? If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful true stories about resilience, boundaries, and the unexpected ways we find strength when we finally stop seeking permission to live our truth.